Welcome back to The Explainer. So, if you were with us for part one, you know we unpacked the whole concept of sovereign immunity. That very old school idea that the king can do no wrong. We also looked at the two main flavors of this, qualified and absolute immunity. Well, today, we're going to see how all of this actually played out in Indian courts. We're tracing the entire journey, literally from the colonial era, all the way up to some really jaw-dropping Supreme Court cases.
Just as a super quick refresher before we jump into the deep end, sovereign immunity is basically this legal doctrine where the state is totally immune from civil suits or criminal prosecution. Like we talked about, it historically stems from that archaic principle that the ruler simply cannot be held legally at fault for the actions of their subordinates. It's wild, but that's where we start. Okay, let's dive into this, because as we established previously, this immunity isn't always a magic blanket shield. The differences between qualified and absolute immunity get incredibly complex and honestly pretty messy when you test them against real-world situations. So let's see how this actually evolved. Section 1. Pre- and post-independence origins.
All right, let's start with a little timeline. In the pre-constitutional era, the doctrine of sovereign immunity was actually born in India, way back in 1858. It was a case called P&O Navigation Company versus Secretary of State for India. This is literally where the terms sovereign and non-sovereign were first used to figure out if the East India Company was liable for a wrong committed by its servant. The Calcutta Supreme Court was interpreting the Government of India Act of 1858 for the very first time. Chief Justice Peacock essentially divided the company's functions into these two categories, sovereign and non-sovereign. Fast forward a bit to post-independence, and we hit the Vidyawadi case. Here, the Supreme Court completely rejected state immunity. They actually held the state liable for the tortious act of its driver, treating the state just like any other everyday employer. Huge step forward, right? Well, hold that thought, because later on in the Kasturilal law case, the Supreme Court took a massive step backward. They totally reverted to that old 1858 P&O rule, distinguishing between sovereign and non-sovereign functions just to shield the state. It's a real roller coaster.
Section 2. The Kasturilal gold theft.
We are definitely going to look at this Kasturilal case in detail because the facts are just wild. Okay, picture this. UP police constables take a man named Raleigh Aram into custody because they suspect he has stolen property. His property, which included gold, silver, the whole shebang, was seized and locked up in police custody, basically the local Malkhana, while the case was pending. Now, Raleigh Aram was soon released on bail, but the police only gave back his silver. When he asked for the gold, they flat out refused. So he sued. He demanded either his gold back or its cash value plus damages and interest. Makes sense, right? Well, the police argued they weren't liable at all. Why? Because the head constable in charge of the Malkhana, a guy named Muhammad Amir, had literally fled to Pakistan with Raleigh Aram's gold and a bunch of cash. The police did register a case against the constable under Section 409 of the IPC and Section 29 of the Police Act, but despite all that, they never recovered the property. So this leaves us staring down a massive, massive legal question. Was the state guilty of negligence for completely failing to safeguard the gold they seized from Raleigh Aram? Prepare yourself for this. The Supreme Court's shocking answer was no. Justice Kajendra Gadkar, writing for the court, held that the state was completely immune and absolutely not liable. To do this, the decision leaned directly on that ancient sovereign immunity doctrine we talked about earlier. They adapted that archaic British concept that the king can do no wrong. So what was the logic here? Well, the court reasoned that because the police officers had acted in the exercise of their sovereign powers, Raleigh Aram was basically out of luck. The power to arrest someone, search them, and seize their property, these are powers explicitly given to police by statute. Therefore, they count as sovereign powers. And because the police were acting under the statutory authority when the gold was taken, the state was entirely shielded from liability. It's a brutal reality check on how powerful this doctrine really is. Section 3. Rudal Shah, Rights and Compensation. Now, we're going to pivot sharply to a very different kind of case. This one challenged that untouchable state power when it came to fundamental rights. The setup is absolutely tragic. In 1953, a man named Rudal Shah was arrested for the murder of his wife. Fast forward to 1968, and the Court of Sessions in Bihar actually acquitted him. He was found not guilty, and yet he remained locked in jail.
When this case finally eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, the jailer actually filed an affidavit full of incredibly flimsy excuses. He claimed an additional sessions judge had ordered Shah's continued detention pending further government orders, and then, completely separately, tried to claim that Shah was of unsound mind. 14 years. Just let that sink in for a second. That is how long Rudal Shah was illegally kept in a jail cell after he was acquitted. 14 years. He eventually managed to file a writ petition of habeas corpus before the Supreme Court under Article 32. He was asking for compensation for his illegal detention, medical treatment, and an ex gratia payment to help him rehabilitate. Crazy enough, by the time the Supreme Court actually heard the case, Shah had already been released. But the court decided to push forward anyway and issued a show cause notice to the state about the financial relief. This framed a completely unprecedented legal issue. Could the Supreme Court actually award compensation for a breach of a fundamental right directly under an Article 32 petition? Like, does Article 21 cover a right to financial compensation when the state brutally violates your fundamental rights? The court delivered a really triumphant ruling here. First off, they completely threw out the jailer's excuses. They found zero evidence that Shah was of unsound mind, officially declaring his 14-year detention totally illegal. But here is the groundbreaking precedent for citizen rights. They ruled that the right to move the Supreme Court under Article 32 for the enforcement of fundamental rights is, in and of itself, a fundamental right. And yes, they decided that the Supreme Court absolutely can award compensation for the breach of a fundamental right under Article 32. This was all about tangible accountability. The state government was ordered to pay compensation of 30,000 rupees to Rudal Shah, on top of 5,000 rupees they had already paid. Now, it might not erase 14 years, but from a legal standpoint, it was a monumental shift away from that absolute immunity we saw in the gold theft case.
Section 4. Next up, defining sovereign functions. So this leaves us with a pretty massive final question to chew on. If arresting someone is a sovereign power that shields the state from losing your gold, but detaining an acquitted person violates rights that force the state to pay compensation, where do we actually draw the line on what counts as a sovereign power? It's a huge puzzle. But don't worry, in part 3 of this explainer, we'll look exactly at how the courts untangle this messy definition, and we'll walk right through Article 300 of the Constitution. Thanks for hanging out with us, and see you in the next explainer.